Okay, so let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining us today at this side event, which looks at some different international perspectives on nuclear security during the decommissioning process. I'm Chris Hobbs, Professor of Science and International Security here at King's College and the chair for this session. Before we get into it, I wanted to pass over to my colleague from the UK Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Angus, who's going to say a few opening remarks. Angus, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Much appreciated, and thank you everyone else for coming to join us. We're very grateful to have you. Otherwise, we could not run an event like this at all because we had no audience. So, aside from absolutely awful jokes, I probably should just introduce myself. As Chris just said there, my name is Angus Girling. I'm the program manager of the Global Nuclear Security Programme at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I work as part of a team along with someone who'd be very familiar with these events, who's the head of the program itself, Philip Richards. He's currently not with us today, so I'm standing in for him. Nuclear security is certainly an issue that has been of absolute paramount importance and has been for quite a long time now, and one that remains unsurprisingly highly relevant throughout the entire life cycle for a nuclear facility, from its actual commissioning and construction to the operation and to the retirement and its eventual decommissioning. How security is actually managed during these stages will vary as threats change, and it is important to explore the challenges encountered and consider how they can be overcome. To this end, the Global Nuclear Security Programme has supported programs focused on nuclear security implementation and organizational culture to help promote the best practices and their adoption by many states and organizations. It really is more than just the old-fashioned or public image sometimes of more guns, more guards, more walls. It can be highly in-depth and quite extensive. We have seen many of the benefits from our programs, however, and are in particular happy with the work undertaken by King's College London through our Nuclear Security Culture Programme. We have them to thank for obviously organising this event and inviting the excellent speakers here today to discuss the challenges in ensuring nuclear security during decommissioning and all the lessons that we've learned. So without any further ado, and gilding the lily and taking up far too much of your time, it is entirely my pleasure to introduce Chris properly, even though he's already introduced himself. So I will hand over to him and he will chair the event, and I hope everyone finds it to be highly stimulating and thrilling. Over to you, Chris.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Angus, for setting the scene for this side event and the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be chairing the panel today, which I believe hits on a relatively unexplored area, but increasingly important aspect of nuclear security, given that tens, if not hundreds, of nuclear facilities are currently being decommissioned worldwide, with many more set to reach the end of their service life in the next few years. Our focus here will be on exploring how nuclear security can be effectively maintained through this process as nuclear and radioactive materials are removed from sites and they return to other uses. Now I briefly want to introduce the speakers for this side event, all of whom are government and industry practitioners who have first-hand experience of decommissioning in their respective national and organizational contexts. First up, with Paul Tonks, Head of Security and Resilience at the UK's Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, who will be speaking on decommissioning activities within the NDA estate. Next, we have Ben Whittard, Security and Resilience Director at Nuclear Transport Solutions, NTS, who will be discussing the role of transportation in decommissioning. Ben will be followed by Katerina Pavlova, Head of the Department for International Cooperation and Public Relations at the State Agency of Ukraine on Exclusion Zone Management and acting Head of the State Agency for Exclusion Zone Management. She'll be talking on challenges for nuclear security during the decommissioning of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And finally, we have Stephen Delomo, who is Senior Manager at the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation, NECSA, who will be speaking on security arrangements during decommissioning at a number of facilities in South Africa. We've asked our speakers to talk for approximately 8 to 10 minutes so that we'll have time for questions and discussion. Given that audience questions are likely to apply to multiple speakers, we're going to run through the presentations first before opening the virtual floor to yourselves. In terms of housekeeping, if you're having difficulty connecting to the audio, please message the Centre for Science and Security Studies host using the chat box. Given the number of people in attendance, we'll be using one-way audio to manage this session with all participants muted. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen if you're using a PC or a laptop. If you're using a smartphone or tablet, you may have to toggle to find this. And without further ado, I'd like to pass over to our first speaker, over to Paul Tonks. Paul, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can we move on to the first slide, please? My name is Paul Tong. I'm with the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. I'm currently the Head of Security and Resilience. I've actually been with the NDA for 6 years now, prior to which I was actually in NDA Heritage as a licence holder, Head of Security on one of the nuclear power stations in the UK. Next slide, please. One of the challenges we certainly see within decommissioning in the UK is the actual financial cost of what we're trying to deal with. The nuclear programme in the UK goes back to the 1940s, late 1940s, and we are currently trying to clear up lots of legacy material throughout the UK and also from the rest of the world across our entire estate. One of the key aspects in relation to security here, you can see, we're spending billions over a long period of time, up to 120 years into the future. And quite often we'll find that because of our regulatory requirements and because of the threat landscape, and we're often finding we're spending a lot of money on the security elements of programs. So for example, for that, at Sellafield, we're currently working on a program to actually deal with some material and make it non-viable to actually use again. And the cost of that program is 65 million. In order to actually increase and improve the security measures relating to that, we need an additional 50 million just to put the security measures in place. So one of the challenges we have in decommissioning is actually trying to find new ways, innovative ways, and better ways to actually deal with nuclear decommissioning from a security perspective in the future. And this is something we're trying to do as we move ahead. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So the key focus for the NDA's mission is obviously the decommissioning of the material and the sites. So security is seen as an enabling factor rather than a key focus for what we're trying to achieve. That often means that frequently when people are designing projects, actually determining how they're going to deal with nuclear material moving forward, is security isn't really thought about up front. So we're trying to change that sort of approach by working closely with our procurement and our project managers in order to ensure that security is considered at an early stage, because there are potential savings to be had by taking that approach. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So what do we actually do from a group perspective? Now, we've gone through a transition in the UK from a regulatory stance since I certainly joined the industry. We used to work under a very prescriptive regulations called technical requirements documents. We've gone through a number of transitions over the years, and we now work against something from the Office of Nuclear Regulation, Civil Nuclear Security and Safeguards, which is the security assessment principles. Now, the big change for us there is previous regulation saw us having to apply prescriptive regulation, where we were told by the regulator, what type of fences we had to have in place, how wide the sterile zones had to be, all that sort of thing. And we've now transitioned to SIAPS, which is a non-prescriptive regulatory stance. That allows us more scope to actually look at addressing the nuclear decommissioning side from a risk-balanced approach. Now, I put this picture up because it shows some of the varied aspects in relation to the NDA group. It's spread throughout the UK. It goes northern Scotland, southern England, western Wales, and over to the east of the UK. So quite a significant number of sites, 17 in total, we're trying to deal with, all at different stages of decommissioning. Now, in previous years, we would have, because of the regulatory stance, we would have spent the same amount of money in many ways on some of the low-level waste concerns, like for instance on the top left there, low-level waste repository. would have had the similar sort of approach to security as one of our high category sites. With the move to SIAPs, what we're trying to change within our security makeup and also the culture of the organisations is the understanding that you can actually deal with security in different ways. And through dealing with it in different ways, you can be more innovative. You can look at the risk and the changes and the threat which actually deal with each individual site. And from there, you can develop security solutions. And as long as you have the sufficient evidence to back your claims and your security case, and that's passed through the regulator, there's lots of opportunity there. An example of that would be one of our sites has gone into care and maintenance at Magnox in Bradwell. It cost us 1.8 million to actually replace the perimeter there. Whereas in reality, if we use the new security assessment principles, which we are in now, there's the opportunity to actually look at it in a different way, reduce the security footprint and reduce the burden because the actual threat is changing. Next slide, please. So the way we really work as an arm's length public body, each of the operational companies, we call them OPCOs these days, are all basically license holders in their own right. So legally, they are actually bound by regulation and by various different regulations from not only the civil nuclear security sector, but also safety, environmental, that type of thing. So the NDA acts as a corporate centre for the group of operational companies in the NDA group, but they are the license holders. Because of that, we are literally an arm's length public body. So we don't actually tell the sites what they must do. We work collaboratively with the sites through a group leadership team. And that group leadership team is actually formed up of members or executives from the NDA Corporate Centre and all of the managing directors from each of the operational companies. From there, the NDA Corporate Centre sets the strategy and the expectations of what we expect sites to do. So, for instance, if we decide, for instance, in business continuity, to go to an international standard, we would tell the group that in agreement. If it's agreed, we would then, as a group, adopt that standard. We then, the corporate centre provides assurance that the sites are delivering security against the standards we have set and also against regulatory and HMG, Her Majesty's Government standards. And the other thing we try and do is to add value. So we're very aware that it could be quite easy to step onto the operational company's toes and try and get involved into the actual tactical and the operational requirements of each of the sites, but really we shouldn't be doing that. So as long as they're meeting our expectations, following the agreed strategy, and we've got the assurance they're doing that, we should only really get involved when we're adding value. And the sorts of value-adding things we're trying to do is where we're looking at value for money, we're trying to look at group strategies to, for instance, sort out the vetting and aftercare, so we don't all pay for it individually. And the supply chain is a key focus from a group perspective, where we've spent a lot of money historically because of the nature of the businesses were all originally separate companies, although we have now moved to a model where they're all subsidiaries of the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. So where they were replicating supply chain assurance checks from security perspective in the past, we're now trying to do that from a corporate centre perspective and use that group weight and also value for money and economies of scale. Next slide, please. Some of the error traps that we've found through the years with this model is, first of all, in order to realistically get people to change and also to be aligned, they need to trust you. So it's all about relationship building. The corporate centre, as an assurance manager, a role I actually joined the NDA to complete, and the assurance manager from security perspective goes around as a face-to-face meeting on a regular basis with all of the operational sites and visits the sites to make sure they understand the individuals. So we really get to know what the problems are on each of those sites. And from those problems and those joint issues, we then determine what we're going to take forward and improve or develop as a group. There's a perception issue as well. it's quite easy when you're sitting away from the operational companies, especially if you're in a corporate centre, to have perceptions of those companies, which may often be unfair because you're not really involved in the detail. So really, it's important to think about the perception. Don't assume and don't try and score each of the operational companies against your perceptions. Actually find out the details, speak to them, and get to the bottom of of what they're doing to really understand why they're doing something in the way they are doing it. Quite often, it's easy to be critical. And one of the things I've certainly found during my time in the nuclear industry is there are many people that join the industry without any nuclear experience or nuclear knowledge, and to be dropped into an assurance role or regulatory role without that knowledge can sometimes lead to that lack of perception. So I really believe that if you're going to provide timely and good assurance, it's really important to have an understanding of the industry and also how security works within that industry. Another error trap is reaction to incidents. We've had some, again, this goes back to understanding each of the operational companies. There may be a minor incident, and we've had examples of this in the past where there have been minor infringements of red lights on the train tracks, which in the rail industry is quite a minor incident, but on the road would be seen in a different way. And sometimes the reaction of the executive, because they don't understand how the operational companies work against their own regulations, because, for instance, transport regulations sit outside of nuclear regulations, and sometimes the reaction from the centre can actually cause disruption and make issues worse, which creates a culture of a reluctance to actually share and be open and transparent. So really how you deal with incidents and how you actually manage those is really important to build in the culture within the NDA group as well. Benefits realisation is another issue. We've had lots of initiatives over the years. It's very difficult in a dispersed group of different companies. One size does not fit all, although there is a perception sometimes from the centre that one size does fit all and they're all doing the same things. It's not the case, and we really should look at things on a risk-based process and also a site-by-site basis. And the key reason to all of that is the reason why. Find out why people are doing things. There may be a good reason that a certain site does something in a different way, which may not be seen on other sites. And that some of that could be based on history. Some of it can be custom and practice and not necessarily needed, but it's certainly worth exploring why people are doing things rather than going back to the perception and jumping to assumptions. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to achieve in the future, and this is really one of the things we struggle with. I mentioned earlier, one of the programs we're doing was a £65 million program with a £50 million security and additional cost to that to make sure that the program is secure. So what we're trying to do in decommissioning is actually get to the point where we realise that as we decommission and we go for the state decommissioning, we will actually see a reduction in the risk to the sites as material is removed. So the example I used earlier about the Bradwell, where we paid 1.8 million to replace the perimeter, if we looked at things in a different way and looked at it from a risk perspective, we've got the opportunity under the security assessment principles to develop and deliver security cases as long as we have the evidence to back it, and we've trialled and we've developed our response to actually reduce the security footprint. So this diagram shows you basically the blue boxes represent areas of the site which wouldn't necessarily have nuclear material or other radiological material in them. The perimeter would be the historic license condition perimeter for a nuclear site. However, as we move through decommissioning, those buildings need to be brought down, the ones in blue, and need to be actually decommissioned. Whereas the material we want to protect are in the red buildings, the two red circles and the one on the left-hand side there. So we're trying to explore approaches where we can reduce the footprint by securing what needs to be secured than trying to secure everything. Sometimes by trying to secure everything, we secure nothing. So the key focus here is actually what is the risk? Can we reduce the footprint as the risk lowers. And there's got to be a point at some stage in decommissioning where a licensed site is fully decommissioned. We can remove the traditional security measures, and we can actually remove guards from those sites as well. We haven't got to that point in the UK at the moment, but it's certainly an area we would wish to explore, and we're doing innovation in order to explore the potential of using new technologies such as perimeter intrusion detection systems that link to some form of autonomous response, whether that be for a unmanned aerial vehicle or a ground-based vehicle. And we're doing some trials in those in the coming years. Again, we're going to be around for a long time, at least 120 years. But on the sites where we can reduce the footprint as early as possible, once we've reduced those footprints, decommissioned, we can then return that land back to use for something else. So those are the key points I wanted to cover, and I'll pass on now back to Chris or to Ben. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Paul, for kicking us off there. And again, if you've got questions for Paul, do feel free to put them in the chat there, and we will come back to them in the panel discussion Q&A at the end. But before that, I want to move swiftly over to our next speaker, Ben Whittard. Ben, are you with us?
Yeah, good day, everybody. I hope you're all well. Can you hear me okay, Chris?
Yeah, coming through well.
Fantastic. Well, good day, everybody. I hope you're all good. It's great to see you all today, and a big thank you to BEIS and to KCL for inviting me to talk today at this session. And hopefully I'm going to give a slightly different perspective. So we've heard from Paul talking about the role of the NDA, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of transport in decommissioning. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So I thought I'd kick off by just explaining our role in the UK's decommissioning programme. So I work for a company called Nuclear Transport Solutions. We were established earlier this year, and we were basically created by the NDA to help them deliver their 120-year mission that Paul referenced earlier by delivering safe, secure and reliable transport solutions. In creating NTS, we also operate PNTL, so that's the ships that many of you will know who transport nuclear materials around the world, and also direct rail services who transport nuclear materials and other radioactive materials here in the UK. So a real key player in terms of enabling the decommissioning mission for the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority and all of the OPCOs that support that mission. And obviously, as we move forward, are going to play a really important part as we start to develop the mission further to hopefully deliver that strategy of returning those decommissioning sites to their past. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. I'll quickly talk about our heritage. So I've talked about PNTL and DRS. So just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the things that we get involved in. So we've moved Magnox fuels, irradiated Magnox fuels from sites to Sellafield. We're currently moving AGR fuel from EDF sites to Sellafield. We move high-level wastes around the world. We also move MOX fuels around the world. So you kind of name it, we've probably moved it somewhere in the world at some point. And you know, the one thing we're incredibly proud of is our safe and secure history. So, you know, something we work very, very hard to maintain, and clearly we're highly regulated in doing so, but nonetheless, something we're very proud of. So a bit of context about who we are and our role in the NDA group, and also supporting other customers around the world as well. So we'll move on to the next slide, and this is where we kind of really get into the crux of some of the security challenges for transport in decommissioning. So the first thing is just to really highlight the importance of transport. So Paul mentioned earlier about, you know, the 120-year mission, the importance of risk reduction, and usually that risk reduction involves moving nuclear materials and other radioactive materials from sites for either reprocessing, for long-term storage, potentially for interim storage. And to do that, clearly we need transport. It's a critical enabler to everything we do in industry, and therefore something that should be considered early as part of your strategic planning for decommissioning. So this is a slide that I use in all of the transport presentations that I do in all of the different forums, just to highlight that. So without transport, you know, decommissioning would grind to a halt. Therefore, it's a really important enabling factor as you consider your decommissioning missions. So we'll move on to the next slide, and we're going to start talking about some perspectives. You know, I've only got 10 minutes, so I've really tried to pick 3 that I think will be helpful for debate in today's session. And the first one is about strategic planning at national and regional, international levels. So, the one thing that we really benefit from here in the UK is having a strategic approach to our decommissioning mission. So we work very, very closely with our colleagues across the NDA group. And what that's allowed us to do is build up a strategic programme to understand the life cycle of all of nuclear materials in the UK. That's really, really important for transport, because that aids our planning for the future needs of transport in the group. So that's not just about assets, what trains, what locomotives, what sea assets will we need, what packages will we need, which goes way beyond just security, but also what capabilities do we need in terms of people and skills. So we can start to plan now for the next 15, 20 years about the types of skills we need. And so you might be sat there thinking, well, why is that important to security? Well, security is a key enabler of that. And for me, understanding that mission, understanding what we need to deliver in the next 20, 30 years, allows me to plot where our teams need to be and the types of capabilities we need to have. And you only need to think about the last kind of 10 years to sort of understand how that's changed. If you look at the UK's industry 10 years ago, from a security perspective, the capabilities and the maturity of that industry look very different to how they look today. So it's a really important point for me. If you're setting out on your decommissioning mission, wherever you are in the world, I'd really encourage you to think about transport to understand what you might need in the future and what role security might need to play in doing so. If we move on to the next slide, we'll move on to the next perspective. So this kind of goes back to something that Paul said, which is about the graded approach. So for me, having been involved in transports and decommissioning for about 15 years now, I started my career at Magnox, moved to the Office for Nuclear Regulation for 5-6 years, and then moved into NTS. The one thing that I've seen is the varied types of transports that we do here in the UK. Some of them involve high categories of nuclear material, some involve very low categories of nuclear material. I've seen transport by road, transport by sea, transport by rail. I've seen transport by inland waterway in Europe. I've seen transports by air, and I've seen a combination of all of those things. So the one thing I would say is transports, in general, but in particularly for back-end materials when you're thinking about decommissioning, need to apply the graded approach. It's really, really important. And Paul mentioned the change in the UK regulations. So we've moved from very prescriptive regulations to very outcome-focused regulations. And that's been fantastic for us. We've been able to apply certain ways of working to some of our transports to be more efficient, to be more effective. And actually, in doing so, improving the level of safety and security to those transports in doing so. So it's been a real game changer for us here in the UK. And the one thing I would encourage you all to do is to think about as categorization being only the first point of a conversation. So if you're categorizing nuclear material in the decommissioning process and it's Cat 2 or Cat 3, that doesn't mean you're going to have to throw all the bells and whistles at it. It's about using very capable professionals to build up that security picture, to demonstrate how they can meet the security outcomes for that particular transport, taking in all the variables involved in the transport, from the route to the terrain to the weather implications, you name it. It's all very, very important. And that's why for transport internationally, we talk about having a dedicated approach. So, when you go to the IAEA, there is a dedicated transport team there with dedicated transport security professionals, because there is the international consensus that transport is different. We don't benefit from fixed sites, fixed facilities, fences. We operate in the public domain. So that's my second point for today. And then we'll move on to the final one, noting that I've got about 2 minutes left, which is about public confidence. And you probably didn't expect to see this one in here from a security perspective, but it's a really important one for me. So as transporters in the world of decommissioning, public acceptance and regional confidence and governmental confidence is absolutely critical to what we do. If we're unable to transport, as I mentioned earlier, the decommissioning mission will stop. It's therefore really, really important that we get the trust and the buy-in of the communities in which we operate. We take this very seriously here at NTS, and finding that right balance between the confidentiality and the availability of information, which for transport can be hard, because clearly you don't want to give away information that could be useful to those who have malicious intent, but at the same time, you want to give confidence to the communities in which you're transporting. So we work very hard carrying out local community exercises. We do global acceptance missions where we go around the world talking to key regions and key governments and stakeholders in certain countries about the transports we conduct, why we do them, the standards that fit around those transports. And we also carry out international exercises, and there's a picture there of an international exercise that took place over in Vienna, involving ourselves and a number of other countries who transport nuclear materials, where we held a tabletop exercise about a transport incident in international waters. That can be really, really beneficial to the international community to demonstrate, the robust levels of safety, security and reliability we apply to all of our transports. So for me, a really, really important part of security, and security is an enabler to this. Quite often when I go to see carriers, particularly overseas, they get very nervous about sharing information. And I totally get that nervousness, but it's about finding that right balance. And the balance will be different everywhere you go in the world, but it's a really, really important stakeholder point. So again, if you're involved in decommissioning and you're involved in transport, have a think about this. It's a really, really important one. So that's, I think, me for today. Let's move on to the final slide, just to double check. Yeah, that is me. So thanks for listening today. I hope that's been helpful. I'd be delighted to answer any questions at the end, and look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ben. I think a question has already come in on your presentation, but we'll take that at the end. In the meantime, let's move on to Katerina. If you're with us, let's go on to your presentation.
Yes, hello, dear colleagues. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share our experience. So, next slide, please. The strategy of transformation of the shelter facility envisages the construction of a new safe confinement with the appropriate infrastructure for the dismantling of unstable structure and their provide treatment up to burial. The purpose of the project to increase the level of safety of the shelter by reducing the risk of collapse of the building structure of the object shelter, namely the dismantling of unstable structure. In this slide, we show the long road of Chernobyl nuclear power plant, of destroyed unit number 4 for time is now. So next slide, please. Just a reminder, terrible picture from 1986, how the unit 4 was looked after accident. Next slide, please. To reduce the consequences of the accident, the shelter facility was created, the structure of which are based on surviving building structures that have an indefinite service life. This shelter facility was created under difficult radiation conditions and does not meet construction regulation. During the Soviet era, state borders were protected and closed, and during the construction, the commissioning of the sarcophage, the norms of physical protection at the local level were not so strict. In 1986, such a term as physical protection in the USSR did not exist, but there were protection of nuclear power plants. According to the documents, first general provisions for safety of nuclear station, PCN 82, did not have the concept of physical protection. But second provision for safety of nuclear, 8897, is already had specification of physical protection of power units. Ukraine became a party to the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and Nuclear Installation in 1993, despite the declaration itself in 1980. Times have passed, times have changed, both the borders of the state and the impact of external threats. Next slide, please. Therefore, in 2004 and 2008, according to the result of the research urban stabilization measures were object shelter planned and implemented that allowed to ensure acceptable level of safety of the object shelter by the end of 2023. The work was carried out within the framework of the plan of implementation of measures at the shelter facility at the expense of the Chernobyl Shelter Fund of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Today, the physical protection system of Chernobyl nuclear power plant provides protection of nuclear facilities, nuclear materials, radioactive waste, and other sources of ionizing at all stages of the life cycle of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Next slide, please. Yeah, here in this slide, you can see the arch. It's new safe confinement in time when the infrastructure for dismantling unstable structure is already created by the project, and the arch was moving on Unit 4. Next slide. At the national level, the issue of counteracting unmanned aerial vehicles over critical infrastructure is acute. Also acute the issue of arrival in 10-kilometer exclusion zone and the movement of tourists on tourist roads during the introduction of a limited regime of measures. We all know that Chernobyl itself and the all exclusion zone is very popular area, and in last 5 years we got a lot of visitors and tourists inside, and big interest to visit exclusion zone. That's why it is extra threats and extra not problem, but extra time and extra measures. We should create some program to protect and make physical protection work, because due to limited possible limited involved of police and responsible physical protection staff, we need to create and increase the level and increase the amount of workers and controls of these issues. And we do hope that in nearest future we will find best solution together with our international partners, how to control and how best to create the infrastructure for these threats, to against these threats. But of course, last year 2020 and this year we have not so big amount of tourists because of COVID-19. But anyway, we soon will start work under the arch, and this will bring more control up to our hands, and we will create special program to control this project. Also this year we start already a movement of transportation of spent nuclear fuel from wet storage to dry storage, and this process will take almost 10 years, and this process also have some special restriction. So that's why these pictures show the most how we understand the most big problem we will have in nearest future in terms of our national plan to create exclusion zone, like more popular zone, popular area for visitors and tourists. So if you have any question, I'm open to answer. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much, Katerina. And yes, we'll take questions at the end, so do feel free to put a question in for Katerina in the Q&A box, and we'll pick it up in a moment. But before we do that, we've got one more presenter. So last but not least, I'd like to hand over to Stephen from Nexa. Stephen, are you with us?
Yes. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for inviting me to this event. Next slide, please. Okay, there are a number of aspects that I will summarize in this presentation. Next slide. Currently, there are three main nuclear installations in South Africa. In Pretoria, in Gauteng, is Nexa. That's where I am based. Nexa houses the Safari 1 research reactor that was commissioned in 1965. And then in Cape Town, the nuclear power plant, Quebec NPP, is situated there. And then our national radioactive disposal facility is situated in Springbok, in the Northern Cape. Next slide, please. Okay. In this slide, I'm trying to give a background of where our decommissioning program came from. So the current facilities under decommissioning were part of the strategic nuclear programs. So these facilities at this point in time are in different decommissioning phases. There's about 23 of these facilities. Some are under care and maintenance, and others are undergoing active decommissioning. And those that have been fully decommissioned, some of them are being reused in line with the authorized regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. So this is an example of some of the facilities that we have decommissioned. This specific facility was converted into an interim storage facility. It is, at the moment, it is storing close to 70,000 drums of waste. Next slide, please. Okay. In this slide, I'm summarizing the national legislation and policy framework for the Republic of South Africa. I have excluded some of the relevant legislation because of time constraints. The Nuclear Energy Act 46 of 99, recently the draft regulations were published, regulation number R407. These regulations, they delineate physical protective measures for nuclear material. And it is worth noting that the National Key Point Act will be replaced by the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, number 8 of 2019. So the Critical Infrastructure Act empowers the owners of critical infrastructure to take such steps as may be prescribed to secure such a critical infrastructure. The critical infrastructure in this case, it also includes nuclear installations. South Africa has ratified a number of international legal instruments in security, in safeguards, and in radioactive waste management. So they are also being applied, but I have not specifically mentioned them here. Next slide, please. If you look at the nuclear installation license for our facilities, there's a specific license condition there that deals with the issues of security. That condition is applicable to both operational facilities and facilities undergoing decommissioning. The condition dictates that the licensee must ensure that safety and security of the site, installations and persons, and also the physical protection system must be designed to protect against the design basis threat, theft, or diversion of radioactive material and sabotage. Then it also talks about the prevention of unauthorized persons from entering the site or any part thereof. So in compliance to this condition, NEXA has developed an integrated security system that encompasses, amongst others, the legislative requirements, guidelines and standards. And in this case, I quote the recently published IAEA Nuclear Security Series number 35G that deals with the security during a lifetime of a facility. The integrated security system is integrated in other organizational processes such as event management system, access and egress from radiological facilities, emergency planning, transport of dangerous goods, internal audits and inspections, procurement and provisions, and so forth. Next slide, please. The security approach, the main drivers for the design of a physical protection system remain the same, whether the facility is operational or in decommissioning. As I have explained earlier, that the applicable condition, it does not differentiate whether the facility is operational or is under decommissioning. The protection strategy that is being applied is a graded approach with sufficient defense in depth in both proactive and reactive elements. NEXA, it's a multi-facility site, so each facility on site has a specific nuclear installation license. However, the general site security processes are applicable for all the facilities. The facility-specific security procedures or plans are developed based on security categorization of the facility, taking into consideration the regulatory requirements, the national and international requirements, as well as the obligations. Next slide, please. Okay, can we go back one slide, please? Can we go back two slides now? One, yes, thank you. The typical contents of a facility-specific procedure, it identifies facility-specific threats based on the abilities and characteristics of the threat. And in trying to mitigate some of the threats, the best practice for decommissioning that we are currently applying is to first decommission equipment and systems that are highly active and contaminated. Then, as we progress, then we'll move to systems that are less active and less contaminated. And by so doing, we are also reducing the hazards in the facility. And then the security categorization is revised accordingly. This document also prescribes additional fiscal control measures required in the facility, and also the on-site movement of equipment and materials. It also integrates various aspects of facility-specific security requirements, and in this case, the nuclear security and the industrial security. Next slide, please. The generic challenges that we are facing during decommissioning is the availability of complete records for some of the nuclear installations, the changing of staff, training of staff, the potential theft of valuable materials, and also the insider threat prevention. Next slide, please. In terms of the efforts we are undertaking to improve the security, amongst others, we are strengthening the security culture through regular assessments. We are implementing programs to retain personnel. There's also periodic training and awareness on security aspects. And we are always implementing international best practices, especially the use of best available techniques, not entailing excessive costs. I think I'm still left with 10 slides again. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. Thank you very much, please.
Thanks very much. Thanks to all the panelists for keeping it to time. I think we've got about half an hour now or so for questions. So again, if you'd like to ask panelists any questions, do feel free to pop them in the Q&A box. I see there is one there already, and I think this in particular relates to Ben's presentation, although it could potentially also apply to the other presenters. So, and it was good that you put that slide in there in terms of public confidence, Ben, because I think this hits at the heart of that in terms of what information can you share during transport and what needs to be protected from a security perspective. So I don't know if you're able to comment any more on that, maybe give some examples, maybe talk about some of the differences from country to country in terms of risk appetite there.
Sure. So I mean, the unhelpful answer to this is it depends. And it depends on the categorization of the transport, the political views involved in a particular transport, the social economic views of the transport. But what I would say is that as far as is practicable, carriers of nuclear materials and stakeholders involved should be as open and as transparent about transports as possible. I think it's really helpful because it builds community and regional confidence in the work that we do, and obviously as I said, in providing that data, that information, and the arrangements that sit around it, not at a detailed level, but at a practical level, can be really, really helpful. I think there's a really good example of it actually in a transport that we carry out, which is we're involved in the transport of MOX fuel from France to Japan. And actually, if I was to ask you now to all go to the Nuclear Transport Solutions website, nucleartransportsolutions.com, if you're interested, you'll see in our news that actually we announced a couple of weeks ago that there was a transport ongoing from France to Japan transporting MOX. Some of you might think, well, why would you do that, Ben? You're telling the world you're moving, a sensitive nuclear cargo. My argument is well, actually, it's in the public domain. People can see it, and it would be really adverse for me to turn around and say I can't tell you about that when it's out in the public domain. So from my perspective, providing that we're giving that communication at an appropriate time, which is once the transport's left, and we're not providing detailed information that could be used by an adversary to potentially attack the transport, then actually I'm very open about sharing it, because I think it's a very helpful thing to do in terms of giving that confidence. We're not trying to hide away from people here. We operate in the public domain, and we need that confidence and that support from the communities in which we work. So I think that's a really good example, actually, of finding the right balance. We don't tell everybody everything about it. That would be the wrong thing to do. But being as open as possible is very, very helpful. So hopefully that answers the question to a certain extent.
Great. No, I think so, Ben. Thanks very much for that. I don't know if any other panelists wanted to come in on this issue of information sort of sharing versus protection, or if not, we can move on to the next question. Okay, well, if not, we've got a question that's just popped up from Rachel Power. Okay, so this is a question again for Ben, also to Stephen as well. And it relates to security checks, in particular for how these, I guess, how these may differ between sort of different agencies and companies, and would this serve as any block against potential sort of partnerships and working? So I guess perhaps looking into the supply chain. I think, well, I'll pass on to Ben in terms of how we sort of do that in the UK, and then maybe to Stephen as well.
Sure. So, I'm just reading the question again. So, in terms of utilising the supply chain, we've got a very robust and controlled way in which we manage the supply chain in the UK. So, the first thing is obviously outlining what the business need is. The second thing is about identifying an appropriate supplier to fulfil that need. But in doing so, a really important element of that is ensuring that you're including your security requirements in the business need, in the procurement that you're doing, not to tell the supplier after you've chosen them that you need to do X, Y, and Z on top of the contract that's been agreed. That's something which is very, very mature here in the UK. We have something called security aspects letters, which we issue to suppliers, which demonstrates and tells them what we need them to do and the standards they need to meet. And then we have very robust assurance mechanisms in place to test those arrangements. And that's really, really important because, many of you, experts on the call, you'll appreciate, adversaries tend to go for the weakest point in the chain. And, that tends to be at the point of least control, which in most instances is the supply chain. And we've seen that through examples and case studies internationally. So it's a really, really important part. I think, for transport particularly, and for decommissioning, there are a range of contractors that can get involved in the decommissioning process, and therefore having those arrangements and that framework set up in a robust way is really, really important.
Great, thanks very much, Ben. And again, Stephen, did you want to take that one on as well, in particular sort of use of contractors as part of some of the decommissioning activities in Nexa and potential security challenges that may pose from a sort of vetting or other perspective?
Yes, I can add on what Ben has just said. The major challenge in the supply chain is the actual vetting of suppliers. Sometimes there are challenges in terms of the information that the suppliers have presented. So that complicates the vetting process. So sometimes it delays the vetting process. But in terms of compliance, they should comply to the standards, comply to the specifications that has been set out. They must also be registered in the database of the National Treasury for them to qualify to be considered for the contract that might be available. And there's one question that was asked previously. I wanted to respond, but you moved quicker. So in our case, we've got the legislated Public Information Forum, the Public Safety Information Forum. So according to the Regulators Act, the nuclear installation license holder is required to have meetings with the community on a quarterly basis to inform them about any situation or any changes regarding their operations. And that also includes the issues of transportation of radioactive waste, but the information that is disseminated during those meetings, it is graded according to security requirements. So some of the organs that are invited during that Public Safety Information Forum, they include municipalities, non-governmental organizations that are affected by the nuclear installation license, respective provincial officers, and the affected organs of state. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much for answering that question, and also my previous question as well. So we've got another interesting one that's just come in on the chat in relation to insider threats and some of the key components of programs established in your different organizations. I think before we go into that, I think this is perhaps a good question for each of the panelists. And here I'd sort of like to ask each panelist as well whether they think the insider threat increases, decreases, or stays the same through the decommissioning process. So maybe we'll give just Ben and Stephen a rest just for a moment, and perhaps if we could maybe throw this over to Paul. I don't know if you'd like to go first, and then Katerina, and then we can go to Ben and Stephen.
Thank you, Chris. Whether or not the insider risk changes in decommissioning, it probably does in a different way, and it depends what you consider, to be an insider threat risk. So one of the things we certainly see more of during the decommissioning is theft. So people do steal things which are being decommissioned. So it's not your regular sort of counter-terrorist type concerns. It's more of a legal sort of, whether or not they've broken the law sort of concerns, and it's that sort of thing. Now, there is probably the biggest challenge we have in the insider threat is the lack of, or perception from many workers that it's not going to happen to us. And that in reality, people don't really understand that there's a lot of potential, certainly within the decommissioning authority, where there's information which has been around, which is historic to us, but could be of use to countries which don't have a nuclear capability. So I'm not sure whether the actual the threat changes from a kind of terrorist or a espionage perspective. However, it's always there. And we do hold material and information which would be, used by people trying to gain that capability. Does that answer the question? You still there, Chris?
I think we might have lost Chris.
Yeah, my connection is a little bit bad, but yeah, I've got most of that. So no, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much. That's that's a great perspective on it. Let's move to maybe Katerina and see if she would concur, or maybe is thinking about it slightly differently.
Yes, of course, at each stage, the more activity and constructors we have in area, the risk increase, of course, but we have very strict rules and procedure for obtaining permits to work on the site. And we control in high level all this process. And I don't think, and we had no any case of some special case in this area. So we still have biggest risk is coming from outside. So it's very important to have special procedure, which it's work especially for this nuclear facility. And I'm quite sure that our procedure and all this in each stage, because of course we have different kind of activities. We have different workers from different companies, but to receive the permission to have the contract to work in our nuclear facility, it is a difficult procedure, and it's controlled in high level. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Katerina, and apologies everyone if I'm cutting out slightly. Let's move over to Ben.
Great, thanks, Chris. So I'm kind of with Paul on this. I don't think as an organisation moves into decommissioning that creates any change to the risk of insider threat. I think for me, the insider threat risk will fluctuate throughout the whole life cycle of a business and the way in which it operates. And I guess for me, from a decommissioning perspective, it's really important that you're managing the mitigation around, the intent, the capability, and the opportunities for insider threats to manifest themselves in your business. So, it's something that we take very seriously here at NTS. We have a very wide insider threat mitigation program that we carry out, and that includes different controls. So, educational awareness activities within the employee base, highlighting the real importance of line manager oversight of people, what to look out for, how changes in personal circumstances can affect individuals in different ways, the ability to raise concerns to management and leadership without fear of retribution, those types of important things. We've also got technical controls, least privilege, need to know, all of the kind of good stuff you'd expect from a mature security organisation. And then obviously, we also have kind of physical controls as well, which implement in our transports particularly, but also in terms of how we manage and protect information. And those arrangements change depending on where we are in our business at any given time. So, I mentioned earlier, we've just gone through a huge piece of organisational change. We've brought 3 organisations together to create nuclear transport solutions, which is a fantastic thing to do. But one of my key roles as part of that change was to make sure that we're managing that change in a very controlled way. And insider threat in particular was one area of real interest to me, because we were changing people's jobs. In some instances, people were moving into new roles, and that could be very disruptive. So, it's a really important part of the overall life cycle of a business, not just the decommissioning process. But I guess if you were to look at it from towards the end of a decommissioning process, I guess you could argue there could be an increase in insider threat, because ultimately you're asking people to do themselves out of a job. And having worked in some decommissioning organisations in the past, I know how that feels, and that can be quite unsettling at times. So again, there's no kind of direct golden bullet for this one. I think for me, having appropriate mitigation in place and being mindful of your insider threat is the most important thing as you move forward, and to assure yourselves that those controls are effective, and you can demonstrate that as well.
Very good. Thanks very much, Ben. And now finally, Stephen, did you want to comment on this as well?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. The only credible insider threat that I remember was, I think in 1982, when somebody placed an explosive at Quebec Nuclear Power Plant. But since then, there haven't been any credible insider threats that have taken place. We have the procedures are in place, the plans are in place. We continually conduct threat insider awareness sessions. However, there are concerns regarding the current stressful conditions due to the pandemic. So we are trying at all times to keep the staff motivated. And then the last aspect is how change management is being handled. So we are always trying to make sure that the changes that are happening in the organization, they don't shock the staff. So we are continually improving on managing change. Thank you, Chris.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. I also know that George Foster has raised his hand potentially on this point and also provided a slightly different viewpoint in the chat. George, I don't know if you wanted to maybe come in here. I don't know if we can enable George to speak, or you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I just wanted to raise the issue about, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I wanted to raise the issue about the way human factors play into the insider threat in a decommissioning environment. Nuclear installations tend to draw their staff, their core staff, from the close proximity to the hinterland of where they're established, they're geographically located. And decommissioning brings a lot of supply chain contractors in because of the change of tempo of activity and the like. But what decommissioning ultimately means is that these staff who are decommissioning a plant are effectively decommissioning their jobs and their employment as well. And unless that is carefully managed by the executive and the management, and we've seen this in the UK, it can drive negative sentiment as you get closer to the date when these jobs draw down. So it's really important understanding how the nature of individuals' values, their beliefs, their behaviors, and their perceptions, most importantly, play into this, because I've seen at firsthand the experience of those people who get concerned about the number of people, executives and senior managers, who come in from the outside in a different environment than the local environment. And that plays into the local employee population, and it can drive negative sentiment. And it is different from an operational phase of the nuclear cycle. It's just something I think people ought to take into account. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Yeah, no, I think that's an important point. I guess in some ways, yes, you're sort of asking people to work themselves potentially out of a job, particularly if that facility is in a sort of relatively remote area and is perhaps the high income employer that sort of might exist there, which can potentially be very sort of demotivating and serve as potential for disgruntlement. So I think that's a good point to raise. Okay, so moving on to another question, and I'm glad this one has come up, because I think there was some very interesting discussion earlier from both Paul and Ben with regards to the UK's new regulatory approach to nuclear security based on SIAP, so security assessment principles, which is more flexible, sort of goal setting, and provides, as heard from those speakers, industry the ability to come up with sort of flexible and bespoke solutions to their security needs during decommissioning. I'd be interested in particular in hearing from either Katerina or Stephen with regards to regulatory approach in their countries, so in Ukraine and South Africa, and whether there is that sort of meets the needs of delivering nuclear security through decommissioning. Is there anything perhaps specific within those sort of regulations with regards to decommissioning, and so on. So yeah, so to Katerina, I don't know if you want to go first and talk about sort of decommissioning within the sort of nuclear regulatory framework in Ukraine and how that's set up for ensuring security.
Sorry, my connection a little bit lost. Yeah, can you repeat, please?
Yeah, no problem at all. So the question relates to regulation. So is there anything specific with regards to security relations and requirements during decommissioning? And then sort of more broadly, does the framework, regulatory framework for nuclear security in Ukraine, is it something which enables sort of flexibility when it comes to security through decommissioning? Or is this something that needs to be sort of worked against when delivering security?
No, we don't have special framework and special event reasons to create it now. But in nearest future, I'm sure we will work on it, and of course the system, Ukrainian system, have some lines where in general we don't have, but if we looking on special area in special facilities, then of course I think in future we will work and create some special rules and some parties which it will be responsible or create some special rules for each process. But in general, today we don't have special plan for this, because from our perspective, today Ukraine have first nuclear power plant which is decommissioning. So it's Chernobyl nuclear power plant, first plant which was commissioning, and first nuclear power plant decommissioning. But for today, we don't have special procedure or even talks about next power unit or next power plant, which it will go to decommissioning process. So I think in that time, when we will have this plan, then it will, our regulator body and regulator process will go with some special lines to create some new rules. But today, in general, no, we don't have special ones.
Great, thanks very much, Katerina. And now over to Stephen. Stephen, in your presentation, you mentioned a number of sort of key national instruments in relation to the Energy Acts and security related regulations. Can you elaborate perhaps a little bit more about the nuclear security regime in South Africa? Is it more on the prescriptive end of the spectrum, and what does that mean when it comes to delivering nuclear security through the decommissioning process?
Okay, our National Nuclear Regulator Act, Act 47 of 1999, it is currently being reviewed. One of the weaknesses, or one of the improvements rather, was to have chapters in the regulations, and the issues around decommissioning and security were not well covered. Currently, we have regulatory guides on nuclear security, on decommissioning, but the guides are separate guides. So based on those gaps, the regulations are being reviewed, and hopefully they will be published early next year. So at the moment, we make a submission to the regulator based on our internal procedures, policies, and processes, and the regulator make a determination as to whether we are in compliance or not. So far, we have been heavily leaning on international guides to further strengthen our security planning. So that's where we are at the moment. Thank you.
Excellent, great. Thanks for letting us know about current situation as well as sort of future plans there in South Africa, Stephen. So moving on to the next question. This is a relatively specific one, so I don't know if anyone of the panelists have any experience in this, but it relates to making sure that contaminated steel, so I guess radioactively contaminated steel from decommissioning projects is properly disposed of, so it doesn't wind up in the sort of general scrap steel market. And there have been cases, I think, that people are familiar with in the past, of radioactive metals recorded in the incident trafficking database maintained by the IAEA, where this does happen, and contaminated scrap metal does get formed into other products. So again, this is maybe quite a specific question, but has anyone want to comment in terms of how I guess some of the sort of non-direct nuclear materials are protected and then I guess disposed of appropriately as more low to mid-level waste?
Chris, Paul.
Please.
This actually links in with a number of issues in relation to, first of all, the inside effect, which was mentioned earlier, and also the management of the supply chain. So we have had some experience a number of years ago where a nuclear temperature probe, for instance, was stolen from a workshop. So as sites are decommissioning, there's the opportunity for people who have got the tendency to steal things. There's been historical cases of people trying to steal copper, particularly from decommissioning sites because of the obviously the value of those metals going out. So it's really being more aware and training your security guards and making sure that your perimeter takes into consideration what's going out of the site. Has it been monitored off the site? Are things actually accounted for? So I think we've built on the experiences of the past, and we're fully aware of the issues we may actually occur there. The other thing I wanted to just touch on, if I may, about the insider threat, which none of us has mentioned so far, is there's this perception that the insiders, a little bit like the old James Bond films, somebody's going to come onto site, but we're moving more into a virtual working relationship. So we mustn't forget, that there's also the ability for those connections within the supply chain in order to actually access our materials and to walk our corridors, so to speak, using virtual means as well as physical means. So the work I mentioned at the beginning during my presentation about the group approach to supply chain security, we are tightening that both from a physical stance, a quality assurance stance as well, to make sure nothing is added to material which is taken onto sites, but also from a cybersecurity stance.
Brilliant. No, thanks very much, Paul. And yes, that helps sort of expand out some of our insider threat discussion to include the non-physical domain as well, which obviously is very, very important. Would anyone else like to comment on that last question, or should we move on to the next one? Please, Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much. In our case, we have improved on detection systems around the facilities, and depending on the value of the material that in the facility, we station security officers in the facilities. We have also improved on the searching of personnel as well as the searching of vehicles, and there are a number of control points right at the facility, and also the main site gate. So at least there's no contaminated material that is leaving the facility. Instead, NEXA is called by the scrap yards to recover contaminated steel or metal, because the scrap yards, they are not licensed to handle contaminated material, and number two, they don't even have the capabilities of handling such material. So we are accumulating material recovered from the scrap yards as I speak now. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much for showing that real practical example with us. Katerina, did you also want to jump in on this, please?
Yes, of course. Chernobyl nuclear power plant decommissioning 3 unit number 1, 2, and 3, and of course we have some of parts and the metal are not contaminated because it's quite a big area and big facility. So it exists officially special procedure for removing this kind of parts and metal from the regulatory control. And we have some procedure how to use these parts after the procedure. So
great, thanks very much, Katerina. My apologies, I think my internet connection is coming unstable again, but I think we're almost at the end of this session. I think there was just one final question there for Paul. We've got maybe a minute or so, Paul, if you wanted to answer it quickly.
Yes,
I'll
talk about what I consider to be the greatest difference between an operating plant and decommissioning. And to me, it's actually what I've noticed is that the tendency for people in decommissioning in the UK, certainly, to employ people from outside of the industry, and they don't fully understand especially people working in offices, etc. They don't really understand the material. They don't really understand the threat. and they tend to think that nuclear culture doesn't apply to them, and it doesn't apply to decommissioning. So that's an error trap I think we need to address and need to be aware of, because different sites, different offices have got different levels of information they're dealing with, or materials, and they're at different stages. But overall, we're still holding a large amount of nuclear material. So there's an error trap there, you know, to make sure that you don't lose sight of the nuclear in the rush to decommission.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Paul. I think that really helps clarify everything. I think we're going to draw the session to a close there, as we're pretty much on time. I want to start by thanking all of the panelists for sharing their really interesting and important insights. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I think thanks everyone as well attending who's managed to stay with us to the end and also participate in the Q&A. I thought some excellent questions in there posed to all the panelists. And then also just, I think, to finally thank UK's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy for sponsoring this event.